Don't make these visa mistakes if you're planning to retire in Japan. So maybe you live in Japan, maybe you want to live in Japan. You've realized that Japan is actually a pretty good place to live. The cost of living is reasonable, it's pretty safe, it's pretty comfortable. It's one of the best places I've been to be an old person in terms of facilities, in terms of how society treats you, and so on. So it's a pretty good option if you want to retire here. Now, there's a few things you might need if you want to retire in Japan. One is some grasp of the language. So, if you're going to live here, especially later on in life, it's going to be pretty important to at least be able to have basic conversations with people, at least be able to understand what's going on around you. You're also going to have your finances in order. So, foreign nationals in Japan are not entitled to seigatsu hogo, which is financial assistance for people who are in poverty and so on. It is possible that you could get that if your local authority wants to do it, but it's not a right and you're not entitled to it. Also, seigatsu hogo is pretty miserable. There's a lot of really restrictive rules around it. It's difficult to apply for, and it's not a great option if you can avoid it. So generally, you want to make sure that you have enough pension income, enough savings, and enough investments to live a reasonable life in retirement. But arguably more important than either of those is your visa, or your status of residence. Now, the bad news, especially for people who want to move to Japan for retirement, is that Japan does not have any kind of retirement visa. So there's lots of countries where if you have enough money, if you can prove you have a steady income, they will give you a retirement visa, which is a visa that allows you to live in the country provided you can support yourself. Japan doesn't have this. I'm guessing Japan figures it has enough old people, we don't need to import more of them. And of course there are some workarounds to this. So of course you could get a student visa. If you wanted to come and study in Japan, maybe study Japanese, maybe study some kind of university degree or equivalent, you could probably get a student visa. There's also something called a long-term visa, which is something that you can get if you want to learn about Japanese culture, for example. Maybe you want to practice martial arts or tea ceremony or calligraphy or something like that. And you can get this long-term visa that will allow you to do that. Now, the main problem with a student visa or long-term visa is that they don't give you a path to permanent residency. So you can get the student visa, you can get the long-term visa, and you can be here as long as you're doing the activities for those visas, as long as your visa is valid. But once it's finished, that's it. You'd have to leave the country and go home. And then the next category of visas are visas that do give you a path to permanent residency. So as long as you've been in Japan for long enough or on the next few visas, you can then apply for permanent residency. This would be things like working visas. So there's various types of visa if you want to work in Japan, and as long as you have one of those visas, you can do the work that's appropriate for that visa type. If you do that for long enough, so if you are a normal person, it takes 10 years of residence to qualify for permanent residency. If you're a kind of highly skilled individual, then you can do it much quicker using a special scheme, and that can be a great option as well. Next, and very, very common, is a spouse or dependent visa. So if you're married to a Japanese national, you can get a spouse visa, and that will allow you to live in Japan, do any kind of work you want, and then after enough time has passed, normally about 3 years of being married, as long as you have a visa that's longer than 1 year, then you can apply for permanent residency and possibly become a permanent resident. Now, if you want to retire in Japan, neither a working visa nor a spouse visa is good enough, in my opinion, because both of those visas are conditional. So as long as you have a job, you can apply for a working visa and you can live in Japan. But if you lose your job, you would no longer qualify for that visa. And, interpreted strictly, you'd have to leave the country quite quickly. Same with a spouse visa. As long as you're married, you can live in Japan with the spouse visa. But if you were no longer married, so if you got divorced or if your spouse died, then you would no longer be allowed to stay in Japan. And absent special treatment, you would have to leave Japan fairly quickly in those circumstances. And for both of those, in my opinion, it's just far too risky. It's far too risky to set up your life here, to maybe buy a home, invest all that time and effort into getting comfortable in Japan, only to have that kind of sword of Damocles hanging over your head, where if you lose your job, you're out. If you lose your spouse, you're out. It's not stable enough. So basically, there's only two good options if you want to retire in Japan, if you want to live in Japan for the rest of your life. And those two options are permanent residence and citizenship. And I would argue if you're serious about staying here, you should be doing your best to get one of those as soon as possible. Now, there are a few caveats. So permanent residence on the whole is wonderful. Once you become a permanent resident, you no longer have a expiration on your residence in Japan. There's no limitations on how you can work. It's much easier to get a mortgage or a loan, and generally people treat you a little bit more stably. The only downside with permanent residence is that it makes you liable to inheritance tax on foreign inheritances and gift tax on foreign gifts as soon as you receive permanent residence. So normally it takes about 10 years for this to happen. If you're on a working visa, for example, your first 10 years in Japan, you wouldn't be subject to those taxes, but spouse visas are and permanent residence is. So if you're changing from a working visa to a permanent residence visa, just be aware of that implication. So for most people, it's not going to make a difference. For some people, it could make a big difference. Permanent residence can take as little as 1 year if you're one of those highly skilled individuals that qualifies for special treatment. It can take 3 years if you're married to a Japanese person. It can take 10 years if you're just living here working as a normal person. But once you reach eligibility, it's a good idea to apply for permanent residence. Right now, the immigration office seems to be pretty overwhelmed all over Japan. I've heard stories that it's taking 1.5 years, maybe up to 2 years, to actually get the permanent residence approved. So there's a big queue at the moment, but it's worth doing. It's definitely worth persisting with. It really takes away a lot of those immigration headaches. So you don't have to renew your visa, but every 7 years you have to go into the immigration office and get a new iDeCo card. That's pretty much the only thing you have to do. Surprisingly, it's actually, at least on paper, easier to become a citizen than to get permanent residence. In order to become a citizen, to apply for citizenship in Japan, you have to live here for 5 years, you have to be an upstanding kind of person, and you have to be suited to become a Japanese citizen. There is a language requirement, but it's a bit vague. It's kind of like you should be at a kind of mid-elementary school level is what it's described as. You should be able to support yourself, you shouldn't have any kind of crime record, and you should be kind of in good standing in your community and so on. Becoming a citizen takes about 1 year as well, and the rather large downside is that if you want to become a Japanese citizen, you have to give up any other nationalities you might have, as long as you're able to. So as far as I'm aware, like Mexico doesn't allow their citizens to give up their nationality. So Mexican citizens can become Japanese citizens and not give up their Mexican citizenship. So nice one if you're a Mexican citizen. Everyone else has to give up their citizenship. And that is a really big step. So I probably would have naturalized decades ago if I'd been able to and still keep my existing passport. I am thinking about naturalizing. I think I probably will naturalize in the future. But there's not a huge difference between permanent residence and citizenship. So some big differences. So if you're a citizen, obviously you can vote, you can run for political office, you can work in certain jobs that are restricted to citizens. You have the right to live in Japan and return to Japan. So unlike a permanent resident who can lose their permanent residence. So recently there was a law brought in that said for people who are not contributing to society, they're not paying Nenkin, they're not paying health insurance, they can lose their permanent residence. Also in COVID, we saw that the Japanese government decided not to allow permanent residents to return to Japan. I think they wanted to do that to citizens, but they weren't able to because of how the constitution is written. So that's one advantage. That's a really big advantage of citizenship, is that you can't be deported. Even if you end up in prison or whatever, you won't be sent out of Japan. You have the right to live here, and obviously it's a big step. So when you become a citizen, you take a new name, you'd have a Japanese name, whether that's in kanji or katakana or whatever. And the requirement that you have to give up your existing citizenship, that's a huge hurdle for most people. At least people who come from a country with a decent passport. If you're from a country that doesn't have a decent passport, that doesn't allow you to travel to most countries without a visa, then upgrading to a Japanese passport is a big step up. Japanese passport is one of the strongest ones in the world. It allows visa-free travel to pretty much everywhere, and it's much easier to move around, travel, etc. if you have a Japanese passport compared to some passports. Now, for someone like me from the UK passport's also pretty strong. So that wouldn't make much difference. I'm already a permanent resident, so becoming a citizen probably wouldn't make that much difference. But for me, I am planning to stay here for the rest of my life, and I think at some point it's going to make sense to make that upgrade. But how about you? Are you here for the long term? If so, have you got permanent residence? Have you got citizenship? And if not, do you think that your existing status of residence is going to be enough going forward? Let us know in the comments. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.